Ada for exposing my sister for stealing from our grandparents. So, I, a young woman of 21 years, find myself struggling to put words to the turmoil inside me. The situation is so convoluted and drenched in emotion that every attempt at clarity seems futile. The guilt hangs over me like a dark, suffocating cloud, and the weight of it all presses heavily on my chest. But to truly convey the depth of my feelings and the magnitude of what unfolded, I must start at the beginning, a beginning steeped in love, trust, and the kind of familial bond that should never be broken. My sister, a year older than me at 22, and I have shared a unique and profound closeness with our grandparents since we were children. These are people who exude kindness, the sort of unconditional love that envelopes you in warmth and makes the world feel safe. They are the kind of people who would give you the shirt off their back without a moment's hesitation, who still write letters in cursive, and who cling to old-fashioned values in a way that is charming rather than rigid. Their modest, cozy home has always been a sanctuary for us, a place where laughter echoes, where their wise eyes twinkle with pride, and where the smell of cookies or homemade soup lingers in the air. One of their endearing quirks, rooted in their old-school mentality, is their habit of keeping cash around the house. It's not just a few bills tucked away for emergencies. They have little stashes here and there, carefully tucked into drawers, under cushions, or inside cookie tins. They believe in the tangibility of money, the kind you can hold in your hands, not just numbers on a screen. And with every visit, they would press bills into our hands, their weathered faces lit with joy as they insisted we take it. Even our protests, "No, please, we don't need it," were met with a wave of their hand and a warm chuckle. Their generosity wasn't just financial, it was an extension of their immense love for us. But then came the first inkling of doubt, the faintest shadow of suspicion that crept into the back of my mind and refused to leave. Over the past few months, something strange began to happen. Almost every time my sister and I visited, our grandparents would mention that they thought some of their money was missing. It was never an outright accusation, nor did they seem overly concerned. It was the kind of absent-minded comment older people sometimes make, as if they were questioning their own memory. "I could have sworn I had $50 more here," my grandfather would muse, or my grandmother would laugh and say, "Now where did that 20 go? I must be losing my mind." At first, I dismissed these comments as nothing more than the natural forgetfulness that can come with age. After all, they were so good-humored about it, treating the missing money as little more than a minor mystery in their otherwise contented lives. But the frequency of these remarks began to gnaw at me. The laughter seemed slightly forced, the casual tone hiding an undercurrent of unease that they were perhaps too kind or too proud to acknowledge. And I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something that didn't sit right. I started paying closer attention during our visits, observing them more closely, though not consciously realizing what I was looking for. I felt torn between my respect for their privacy and my growing unease. The thought that anyone could take advantage of their trusting nature, let alone someone within the family, seemed impossible until it didn't. This unease followed me like a shadow, whispering in my ear, planting seeds of doubt that I tried to dismiss but couldn't entirely ignore. Unbeknownst to me, this was only the beginning of a chain of events that would unravel the fabric of our family and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about loyalty, morality, and the consequences of doing what one believes to be right. The clues were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they built up over time, each one adding to the quiet storm brewing in my mind. And then, as if fate itself had orchestrated it, the moment came when I could no longer turn a blind eye. Last weekend, the unease I had been harboring for months finally reached its boiling point. My sister and I made the familiar journey to our grandparents' house, a place that had always felt like a second home. As we pulled into the driveway, I tried to shake the heavy feeling pressing down on my chest, telling myself that perhaps this visit would be different, that my suspicions were unfounded. But deep down, I knew better. I had come prepared to look for the truth, even if I wasn't entirely ready to face it. The visit started off like any other. My grandparents, as warm and welcoming as ever, greeted us with hugs and offers of homemade snacks. The house smelled of cinnamon and old wood, the comforting aroma that always made me feel safe. Yet, I couldn't fully enjoy the warmth of the moment. Every word, every gesture from my sister felt like it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I found myself watching her more closely, noticing little things I hadn't before: how she avoided eye contact with our grandparents or seemed unusually preoccupied. As the afternoon wore on, I tried to act natural, engaging in conversation and laughing along with our grandparents. But my nerves were on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then it did. At one point, my sister casually mentioned that she needed to use the bathroom. It was a perfectly normal comment, something that wouldn't ordinarily raise suspicion. But as the minutes ticked by and she didn't return, a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. And then, almost as if guided by instinct, I decided to check. I moved quietly through the house, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear it. As I approached the hallway leading to the bedrooms, I saw that the door to our grandparents' bedroom was slightly ajar. A sliver of light spilled out into the hallway, and I heard the faint rustling of movement inside. My breath caught in my throat. I inched closer, peering through the gap in the door, and what I saw froze me in place. There she was, my sister, standing in front of our grandparents' dresser, the top drawer pulled open. Her hands moved quickly, almost frantically, as she rifled through the contents. And then I saw her pull out a small stack of cash, fold it, and shove it into her purse, which was perched on the bed beside her. The sight was surreal, a betrayal so blatant and raw that I struggled to process it. For a moment, I just stood there, my mind reeling, unable to believe what I was seeing. But then, without thinking, I stepped into the room. "What are you doing?" The words came out sharper than I intended, cutting through the quiet like a blade. She spun around, her face a mask of shock and guilt. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with tension. She scrambled to explain, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm just borrowing it," she said, her voice high-pitched and desperate. I was going to put it back, I swear. But I could see through her facade. Her excuses were flimsy, her tone unconvincing. This wasn't the first time, and we both knew it. I felt anger rising in my chest, mingling with an overwhelming sense of disappointment. "Borrowing it? That's BS, and you know it. How many times have you done this? How long has this been going on?" My voice shook with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She begged me not to say anything, her pleas growing more frantic as she realized I wasn't backing down. "Please," she said, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. "It's not a big deal. They'll never notice. Just, don't tell anyone, okay? I'll stop, I promise." But her words only deepened the ache in my chest. This wasn't about the money. It was about trust that had been shattered in a single moment. Our grandparents, who had given us so much love and support, who had always put us first, didn't deserve this. The thought of them finding out, of their hearts breaking, was almost too much to bear. But I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't be complicit in her deceit. "I can't," I said finally, my voice heavy with resignation. "I can't just ignore this." Her face crumpled, and she let out a small, choked sob. But I had made up my mind. The truth needed to come out, no matter how painful it might be. The rest of the visit passed in a blur. My sister avoided me, her demeanor shifting from desperate to sullen. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, the weight of what I had seen and the decision I had made pressing down on me. When we finally left, the car ride home was silent, the tension between us palpable. I wanted to reach out to her, to find some way to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. But every time I tried, the image of her taking that money, of her betrayal, flashed through my mind, and I couldn't find the words. By the time we reached home, I knew what I had to do. My hands trembled as I dialed our parents' number, my heart pounding as I recounted what had happened. The words felt heavy in my mouth, each one carrying the weight of a decision that I knew would change everything. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then came the anger, the shock, the disbelief. My parents were devastated, their voices thick with emotion as they tried to make sense of it all. What happened next would unravel our family in ways I couldn't have imagined. But in that moment, all I could do was brace myself for the fallout, knowing that the path I had chosen, while painful, was the only one I could live with. After we left, a sense of profound unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like a persistent shadow. I had replayed the incident in my mind countless times, the look of shock and guilt on my sister's face, the frantic, hollow explanations she offered, and the way she had begged me not to say anything. It felt as though my entire world was caught in a whirlwind, spinning with no clear direction, and the weight of the decision I had to make bore down on me with relentless pressure. I didn't want to destroy our relationship, to shatter the bond that had tied us together since childhood. But how could I ignore what I had seen? How could I turn a blind eye to the betrayal that had already begun to unravel the trust that bound our family? The hours that followed were torturous. I paced my room, my phone clutched in my hand, torn between silence and action. Every scenario played out in my mind, each one more fraught than the last. If I said nothing, the cycle would undoubtedly continue. The love and respect our grandparents had for us would remain, but it would be built on a foundation of deceit. And if I spoke up, I knew the consequences would ripple through our family like a stone thrown into still water, breaking apart the fragile peace we had always known. In the end, the weight of doing nothing felt heavier than the guilt of exposing the truth. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone and called my parents. The words spilled out in a rush, each one dragging a piece of my heart with it. I told them everything: how I had caught her, what she had said, and the unease I had felt in the months leading up to it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before my mother's voice, shaky and tinged with disbelief, broke through. "This can't be true," she said, her words heavy with denial. She couldn't do that. But the evidence was irrefutable. My father, usually a man of measured calm, was furious. His voice, sharp and filled with anger, carried a weight that I had rarely heard before. "We have to tell them," he said, and I knew he meant our grandparents. My heart sank further. As much as I had prepared myself for this moment, the reality of it was unbearable. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that my parents might handle it quietly, that we could shield our grandparents from the pain of knowing the truth. But my father was resolute. "They deserve to know," he said. "We can't keep this from them." The next day, my parents sat down with our grandparents and told them everything. I wasn't there, but I could imagine the scene vividly. My grandmother's gentle, weathered face crumpling as the words hit her, the tears welling up in her eyes. My grandfather, always the pillar of strength, shaking his head in disbelief, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he processed what he was hearing. They had given us so much love, support, a sense of security, and in return, they had been betrayed in the most personal way. When my sister was confronted, she denied it at first. Her voice was steady, defiant even, as she insisted that it wasn't true. But the evidence was overwhelming, and under the weight of my parents' questioning, she eventually broke down. "I only did it a few times," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it would matter." The room fell silent, the air thick with a mix of anger, sadness, and disappointment that seemed almost palpable. The fallout was swift and devastating. My parents were livid, their anger simmering just beneath the surface every time they spoke to her. They couldn't understand how she could do something so thoughtless, so cruel, to people who had done nothing but love her unconditionally. My grandparents were heartbroken. The light in their eyes, the warmth that had always radiated from them, seemed dimmed, replaced by a shadow of hurt and betrayal. And my sister, she turned her anger on me. The messages started almost immediately. Her words were laced with venom, each one a dagger aimed squarely at my heart. "You're a traitor," she wrote. "You've ruined my life. How could you do this to me?" The accusations stung, each one a painful reminder of the rift that now separated us. She called me a snitch, said I had blown things out of proportion, and accused me of turning our family against her. And then, as if to solidify the divide, she blocked me on social media, a small but symbolic act that drove home the reality of our fractured relationship. I tried to remind myself that I had done the right thing, that my actions were driven by a sense of duty to our grandparents and a desire to uphold the values they had instilled in us. But the guilt was inescapable. I felt like I had set off a chain reaction that had torn our family apart. My parents reassured me, telling me that I had done what needed to be done, but their words did little to ease the ache in my chest. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in our family remained thick and unyielding. Every conversation was tinged with sadness, every interaction a reminder of the trust that had been broken. My sister's absence was glaring, her silence a constant reminder of the bond we had once shared. I found myself questioning everything: my decision to speak up, the values that had driven me to do so, and the relationships that now seemed irreparably damaged. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the weight of it all felt unbearable, I would think of my grandparents. I imagined them sitting together in their living room, the once warm space now tinged with a sense of loss. I wondered if they could ever truly forgive her, if the love they had always shown us could withstand the betrayal they had endured. And I wondered, too, if my sister and I could ever find our way back to each other, or if the chasm between us was too wide to bridge. The path I had chosen was not an easy one, and the consequences were more far-reaching than I had ever anticipated. But deep down, I knew that silence would have been a greater betrayal. My grandparents deserved honesty, even if it came at a cost. And so, I carried the weight of my decision, knowing that while it may have fractured my family, it was born of love, a love that, despite everything, I hoped would one day heal the wounds we had inflicted on each other. The days following the confrontation were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. The fallout from my decision rippled through my life in ways I hadn't anticipated, leaving behind a fractured family and a gnawing sense of guilt that refused to let me go. Despite my parents' reassurances that I had done the right thing, the burden of everything that had happened weighed heavily on me. I felt like an intruder in my own family, a catalyst for the pain and heartbreak that had taken root. I had acted out of love and a sense of duty, but the aftermath left me questioning if there could have been another way. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, dissecting every moment, every word, and every choice. Should I have confronted her in private? Should I have given her a chance to make amends without involving our parents or grandparents? These questions haunted me, their answers elusive and impossible to pin down. The guilt I felt was compounded by the venom my sister continued to direct at me, her words cutting deeper than I cared to admit. She painted me as the villain, the destroyer of our family, and part of me wondered if she was right. Yet, when I thought of our grandparents, of the love and care they had shown us throughout our lives, of their unwavering kindness and generosity, I knew I couldn't have stayed silent. They deserved to know the truth, even if it hurt. They deserved to have their trust honored, not exploited. But knowing this didn't make it any easier. The damage had been done, and it felt like there was no way to repair it. The tension in our family grew thicker with each passing day. My parents were still furious with my sister, their anger simmering beneath every conversation. They couldn't understand how she could have done something so selfish, so reckless, to people who had only ever loved her. My sister, in turn, withdrew completely. She refused to speak to me, cutting me off in every way she could. Her absence was glaring, a constant reminder of the bond we had once shared and the rift that now separated us. Our grandparents, perhaps the most affected by all of this, tried to maintain a brave face, but the hurt was evident in their eyes. They still welcomed us into their home, still showered us with the same love they always had, but there was a sadness in their demeanor that hadn't been there before. It was as if a part of their joy had been stolen along with the money. Seeing them like that broke my heart all over again. Time passed, and the pain slowly began to dull, though it never fully went away. My parents tried to reach out to my sister, to help her see the gravity of her actions and encourage her to make amends, but she resisted. She insisted that I had overreacted, that I had blown everything out of proportion, and that I was the reason our family was in disarray. Her refusal to take responsibility only deepened the divide, making reconciliation seem like an impossible dream. For months, I lived with the weight of it all, unsure if things would ever get better. I threw myself into work and school, trying to distract myself from the turmoil at home. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the guilt lingered. I thought about writing to my sister, trying to explain my actions and express how much I missed her, but every time I sat down to do it, the words failed me. How could I make her understand when she refused to see the truth? How could I bridge the gap when it felt like we were standing on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm? It wasn't until much later, almost a year after everything had happened, that I began to see a glimmer of hope. One day, out of the blue, my sister reached out to me. Her message was brief and tentative, but it was the first time she had spoken to me since the incident. "Can we talk?" she wrote. My heart raced as I read those words, a mixture of hope and trepidation flooding through me. When we met, it was clear that the months apart had taken a toll on both of us. She looked tired, her usual confidence replaced by a quiet vulnerability. She started by apologizing not just for what she had done, but for the way she had treated me afterward. She admitted that she had been angry, not just at me but at herself, and that it had been easier to direct that anger outward than to face the consequences of her actions. She told me that she had started seeing a therapist, someone who had helped her work through the guilt and shame she had been carrying. It wasn't an easy process, she said, but it had forced her to confront the choices she had made and the impact they had on our family. She had also apologized to our grandparents, who, true to their nature, had forgiven her with open arms. They were hurt, of course, but their love for her hadn't wavered. As she spoke, I felt a weight begin to lift from my chest. For the first time, I saw a path forward, one that, while not without its challenges, held the possibility of healing. We talked for hours that day, sharing our feelings and airing the grievances that had festered between us for so long. It wasn't a perfect resolution, the scars of what had happened would always remain. But it was a start, a chance to rebuild the relationship we had nearly lost. In the weeks that followed, my sister and I worked to mend our bond. It was a slow process, one that required patience and understanding on both sides. But as time went on, I began to see glimpses of the closeness we had once shared. We laughed together, reminisced about old memories, and supported each other in ways that felt genuine and real. The rift that had divided us started to close, replaced by a sense of connection that, while fragile, was deeply meaningful. Looking back, I still grapple with the question of whether I handled things the right way. Perhaps there was a better way to address the situation, one that would have caused less pain and upheaval. But I also know that the truth needed to come out, that silence would have been a greater betrayal not just to our grandparents, but to the values they had instilled in us. In the end, I've come to accept that life is messy, that there are no perfect solutions or easy answers. What matters is that we learn from our mistakes, that we strive to do better, and that we hold on to the people we love, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. My sister and I are not the same as we once were, but perhaps that's okay. We are stronger now, forged by the fire of our shared pain, and bound by the love that, despite everything, has endured.